If there's any time that the media should be careful about getting you fact-checked information and context, it should be when people are saying they're scared of World War III. Do the stakes get any higher? But because so much of the media is so broken, what we get instead is a rush of talking heads saying whatever and crucial context being left out. The media contributes to confusion and fears while failing to do its job. All that happened in the wake of the U.S. attacks on Iran's nuclear sites. Coming up, the media has been misleading you about what is known and not known about Iran's nuclear activities. Also about the president's powers. We all need media to be better than this. Meanwhile, check this out. Just days before Israel's attack on nuclear sites in Iran, the head of a group that follows the Middle East closely predicted what was about to happen. And this is not a case of it being a lucky guess or like one of those people who makes tons of predictions and this one happened to come true. This was after extensive analysis of specific events that were underway and what's called war game simulation. He joins me today. Listen to this.
The way that we see the Israel-Iran conflict playing out has about a 95% accuracy rate for how we played that out in our scenario that took place in May.
But even this guy cannot get through to many of the big mainstream news outlets. They don't want to hear from him, despite his obvious expertise. He'll explain how news agencies are so deeply committed to their own bias that they would rather talk about what they think is happening than what's actually happening. He'll cite a couple of big news agencies along the way as particularly egregious. Plus, your amazing responses to last week's episode. And this show gets its first fan letter from a non-human. All that and more coming up today on They Stand Corrected. Hello and welcome. So awesome to have you here. My name is Josh Lebs, and this is my podcast, They Stand Corrected, which fact-checks the news and explains what's driving the systemic failures in the news media. I also talk about what we can do about it. In fact, recently in my newsletter that comes along with this show, I provided email addresses for lots of the big news agencies, along with a piece explaining how to contact them and copy me in so that we can chase after them to do better. You can find links to all that in the notes for this show or at my website, joshlevs.com, JOSHLEVS.com. And it includes lots of links and images and stuff. I don't ask you to take my word for anything, and I invite you to tell me if I get something wrong. The newsletter is free, but a great way to support the show is to choose to become a paid subscriber. If you do, then you get extra content. And I'm so grateful to people who do that. One of the newest is, Carol Carnevale has joined as a founding member. Thank you so much, Carol. She writes, I deeply support what you are doing. She also mentions that she's relieved to know I'm back safely from Israel. If you have not heard last week's episode, I encourage you to hear it. She sent me photos of her adorable dog, Daisy, a rescue, mostly a staffy. And she says, Daisy says truth and context are the best treats for human news consumers. Thank you, Josh, for fetching the facts for us. Love, Daisy. So sweet. I'm going to put a picture of this adorable doggy into the newsletter, too. You can see it there. Also, since Carol is a founding member, she was able to send me topics that she would love for me to look into. That's something I do for my paid subscribers. She has asked about some new claims involving the November election and also the numbers of attendees from the No Kings marches. 2 episodes ago, I talked about the simultaneous military parade that Trump was having and the No Kings marches. Anyway, let's jump into what I have for you today.
For the first time ever, the United States utilized 30,000-pound bunker-busting bombs, a dozen of them, on Iranian nuclear facilities in Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan.
CNN, among the many news agencies jumping in to do breaking news after the United States launched attacks on Iran's nuclear sites. First, let's establish some basic context here. Iran is dangerous to the free world. It is driven by a religious zeal to force its version of Islamist government onto the world. It constantly threatens other nations, including the United States, Europe, and Israel. Lots of countries in the Middle East stand against Iran. I had an analyst on this show from Egypt who talked about the Iranian axis being the evil axis in the region. After Israel's recent attacks on Iran nuclear sites, German Chancellor Friedrich Merz said, quote, "This is the dirty work Israel is doing for all of us. We are also victims of this regime. This mullah regime has brought death and destruction to the world." And then after that came the U.S. doing that work as well. Amid all this, one of the most important pieces of information you need is to know how close Iran has been to a nuclear weapon. So CNN, of course, brought in Christiane Amanpour, who argued that Iran was not on the precipice of having a nuclear bomb.
US intelligence and global intelligence, other than Israel, says that they have not seen any move towards either making a political decision to militarize, or indeed, if it did so, it would take several years to actually be able to launch a conventional, well, not conventional, but a nuclear weapon. They could do a dirty thing, all sorts of sub-full nuclear weapons, but it is deemed impossible for the next several years.
Christiane gets so much wrong that I usually don't even bother to ask CNN questions about what she's saying. But in this case, I'm not even sure what she thinks she's talking about. So I did message CNN, and of course, I have not heard back. I have pieced through the words that she said there, trying to make sense of them. Here's what I can tell you for sure. At the very least, she is not giving you the whole truth in terms of what intelligence agencies have actually found. The U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency said recently that while Iran almost certainly is not producing nuclear weapons, it has taken actions that reduce the time required to produce sufficient weapons-grade uranium for a first nuclear device to probably less than 1 week. The Associated Press reported on that as well, and they said experts said it could then be months for a working bomb. Austrian intelligence, meanwhile, went further, saying Iran's nuclear weapons development program is well advanced. Iran, of course, is calling this fake. Of course they are. Meanwhile, there is some great reporting in the Times of Israel. I'm going to give you some numbers here. As you may know, I don't do a lot with numbers on this show, so don't worry about the specific figures I give you, but when you hear these numbers, you'll know why I'm telling you them. It's a matter of big and small. All right, listen to this. According to the International Atomic Energy Agency, Iran is the only country in the world that enriches uranium up to 60%, a number that has no civilian use. That rate is still just below the 90% threshold required for a nuclear weapon, but far above the 3.67% limit set under a 2015 agreement with world powers. All right, I want to pause on that for a second. By the way, you can see all this stuff in my newsletter. I have posted the links to all these analyses. So there was this agreement in 2015 that it's not supposed to go above 3.67%. How high has it gone? 60%. Anyone telling you Iran is just doing this for peaceful nuclear energy purposes or whatever, they clearly don't know what they're talking about, or they do know what they're talking about and they're lying on purpose. All right, there's more. Even the New York Times provided a different picture from what Christiane was providing there. You know, the Times always presents everything in the most, well, especially anti-Israel way possible. But even they reported this about what inspectors from the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, were saying. The Times writes about the fact that it was enriched up to 60%. And here's a quote from the Times. "The increase gives Tehran the capability to produce the fuel for roughly 10 weapons, up from around 5 or 6 when President Trump was inaugurated in January." Now, here's a kind of wild twist in the media. Mark Levin has his own show, and he's on Fox as well. He pointed out a lot of this reporting. In fact, he read from the New York Times report.
Now, the Director General of the IAEA, that is the unit within the UN, is responsible for this. His name is Rafael Grossi. Now, Grossi wrote that the significantly increased production and accumulation of highly enriched uranium by Iran, the only non-nuclear weapon state to produce such nuclear material, is of serious concern.
Interestingly, Mark Levin also looked back at history from a century ago, when some America First groups back then were saying, don't get involved in Europe. It's not a fight we want. We need to keep out of it. And they downplayed the dangers. And then, of course, came the Holocaust and Pearl Harbor and World War II. This is stuff I reported on recently for the Memorial Day episode. Okay, you and I don't know just how close Iran is or has been to a nuclear weapon. The question is, what kind of a risk democracies are willing to take? How much further are they going to let Iran go? Every U.S. president, both parties, for decades, has faced this same question. So it's not a sudden issue that just popped up. Here's President Clinton speaking 30 years ago. He pointed to what Iran was seeking from Russia at the time.
This fact, together with other evidence about Iran's nuclear program, supports only one conclusion. Iran is bent on building nuclear weapons. The specter of an Iran armed with weapons of mass destruction and the missiles to deliver them haunts not only Israel, but the entire Middle East, and ultimately all the rest of us as well. The United States, and I believe all the Western nations, have an overriding interest in containing the threat posed by Iran. Today, Iran is the principal sponsor of global terrorism. It seeks to undermine the West and its values by supporting the murderous attacks of the Islamic Jihad, Hezbollah, and other terrorist groups.
So, all this is something the United States has been warning and concerned about for decades. Presidents George W. Bush, Obama, Biden, and Trump have all said Iran cannot get a nuclear weapon, and they all left the military option on the table. That is context. That brings us to another question, which is about congressional authorization. There's a lot of reporting about the debate on whether a president needs congressional authorization for a strike like this on nuclear facilities. Lots of people weighing in, but the answer is not clear. You see lawmakers like AOC and Bernie Sanders claiming it's so obvious this was not constitutional. They're wrong. It's not obvious. This is a place in which I was surprised that the media has not been pointing out something that President Obama said. This was in 2013 when he was threatening strikes against Syria. Here's a CBS report from back then.
Mr. Obama asserted that he has the authority to attack Syria alone, but predicted Congress will back him up.
As Commander-in-Chief, I always preserve the right and the responsibility to act on behalf of America's national security. I do not believe that I was required to take this to Congress, but I did not take this to Congress just because it's an empty exercise. I think it's important to have Congress's support on it.
The most influential news agency in America probably is the Associated Press. They had a story just a couple of days ago, more than 800 words long, about debates on whether a president has the right to do this. And somehow they did not mention what Obama said. They did have a generic line claiming that presidents in both parties have ignored the legislative branch's constitutional authority. But that's not what this is about. It's not clear that this is about ignoring. It's a question of at what point something is a war and therefore requires congressional approval. And really, the people we should be hearing from about this are constitutional experts who have seen how this has been decided in the past. And maybe ultimately this will be a question for the judicial system. Obviously, these concerns are really important. The idea of just one person, the president, being able to make a decision like this without getting buy-in from Congress can be very disturbing, but it also might be within constitutional powers. Anyway, any talk about whether Trump has this power or not should include a look at what former presidents themselves have said, obviously. All right, one more thing on this. Some in the media are trying to cast this whole situation as the United States joining Israel's war against Iran. That is not what's happening. On MSNBC, overnight, the network carried Sky News from the UK, which is owned by the same company and generally has the same bent to the political left. Anyway, they had on a guest who was the former head of Channel 4, which is also a left-leaning network. Wow, everything I just told you sounds so meta, didn't it? One news organization carrying another one, which in turn interviewed someone from a third one, whatever. Point is, in this interview, the former head of Channel 4, Dorothy Byrne, she cast this as a two-party conflict that Brits want to keep out of.
They do not want us to get involved in this. If it's Iran versus Israel, what side should we be on? In surveys, they say we shouldn't be on anybody's side.
But another panelist next to her, former Secretary of State Malcolm Rifkind, jumped in and corrected her on that.
You are implying all along this is purely between Israel and Iran. It's nothing to do with us. I'm sorry, this is about nuclear proliferation. And Britain has as much interest as anyone else. The Non-Proliferation Treaty bans Iran from developing nuclear weapons. They're very, very close, till yesterday, to doing that. We all benefit. The world benefits if that potential has now been removed.
The UK definitely benefits if that happened. And this is where we get back into unknowns. We all know that intelligence can be flawed. Well, just look at the Iraq War, where the pretext involved weapons of mass destruction that turned out not to be there. But this is not Iraq. This is different. The U.S. is not talking about going in with ground troops and replacing the existing government. So the calculation for any president, Republican, Democrat, whatever, is different. The calculation comes down to, do we take these actions to prevent Iran from having nuclear weapons? All right, all that said, here's a question for you. Have you heard, seen, or read any of this context in the mainstream media? Like literally in mainstream news organizations anywhere? Let me know. Coming up, a guy whose prediction was amazingly accurate, but much of the media refuses to hear from him.
Listen up, folks, it's a somber tune. We're living on the edge of a nuclear moon. Don't be naive, it's a dangerous game. In this world of power, things won't be the same. No, 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 or it won't be the same. No, no.
A great book to tell you about. It's called The Power of Instinct. It's by Leslie Zane, who is brilliant. In fact, I want to have her as a guest on this show, and I will. Her book is a must-read for anyone who wants to understand how people get persuaded. For marketers, that means encouraging people to buy things. For campaigners and activists, it means getting people to believe things. So her research is helping me understand how people get persuaded to believe lies. I want to understand that so that I can help people develop a deeper relationship to truth, helping them develop an instinct to seek out the truth before forming opinions, theories, narratives, all that. Anyway, her book is in the vein of Malcolm Gladwell's Blink and Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow, and I'm welcoming her as a supporter of They Stand Corrected, Leslie Zane's The Power of Instinct. There is a group called the Middle East Forum. They do some fantastic analysis of all things in that region. They have experts who understand all the players, their motivations, their military and financial entanglements, ideologies. They predicted what ended up happening. Gregg Roman is the executive director. He's the one who wrote this column on May 24th about what he called Israel's imminent attack on Iran's nuclear sites. I spoke with him and asked him how he knew.
If you were able to put three things together: 1, President Trump's 60-day window for diplomacy to work; 2, Israel's reports of the encroaching threat of an Iranian nuclear device; and 3, the Iranian leadership's reactions in their public statements about atomic weapons, and he put the three of those together on a timeline, then substantiated by other reports, like at the beginning of May, the Defense Intelligence Agency in the United States, which is part of the Pentagon, said that Iran was 1 week away from a nuclear weapon. 2, when the Austrian intelligence services in their annual report said Iran was marching towards a bomb. And also, just having covered this subject for the past 15 years, you distill all of that together into a vat, and the only reasonable conclusion was that Israel was getting ready to strike Iran.
It is incredible to look back at your piece now and see how prescient it was. To me, this also makes it extra surprising that Iran was so easily taken, so unprepared.
I guess no Iranian policymakers were reading the Middle East Forum. But jesting aside, I think that Iran had an overinflated belief in its own deterrence capability, and that it was fooled through the strategic ambiguity that Israel has used against its enemies for the past 60 years. This is the single greatest surprise strike since 1967 and the Six-Day War. And the Iranians should have paid attention to what happened with Hamas and the strikes after the October 7th attacks. They should have paid attention to the deeper attacks against Hezbollah. Actually, fortunately for Israel, it didn't, and now you see the consequences of that.
Okay, so given Gregg's obvious expertise, I asked him for his take on what he's seeing in big mainstream media coverage of the fighting between Israel and Iran.
I think the most egregious is the double standards in reporting on civilian casualties. When Israel has a civilian die, it's just another Israeli death reported. But when you have an Iranian, whether they be a member of the Revolutionary Guard, member of government, someone who might be in proximity who works with the regime, and they are killed, they're called an Iranian casualty, a civilian casualty. And then beyond that, you also get to the second theme, which is particularly egregious, misrepresentation of military actions and terminology. Instead of calling an Iranian ballistic missile with cluster munitions aimed to target civilian areas, it's called an Iranian rocket fell in an area near central Israel. The phraseology that they use is not showing the sheer amount of destruction that the Iranians are trying to enact on Israeli civilian centers, especially with the bombing of the hospital in Beersheba, Soroka Hospital. Underlining a lot of these themes is the false moral equivalence between Israel and Iran. You have a 46-year history of hate, calls for death, destruction, and genocide of the Jewish people on the Iranian side, and then on the Israeli side, they're trying to take out a weapon, which would make Israel, as it was called by an Israeli prime minister in the past, a one-bomb state. The thing that connects the misrepresentations, the double standards, the false equivalence, is the omission of context about Iranian aggression. These things, when you put all of them into one basket, really shows you the media bias, both in European and North American media, against Israel, and neutral, or if not more so, in Iran's favor.
He pointed to some specific examples of all this. One was on CNN when Iran launched a missile that killed 4 members of an Israeli Arab family. Rather than reporting on it as terrorism, which it was, a specific effort to kill civilians, CNN instead built an entire report around the idea that somehow Israel chooses to leave Arab residents relatively unprotected. This is so CNN, trying to find a way to blame Israel. And what it wrote was false. Here's a line from this report on CNN.com. They were talking about this town called Tamra, and they said only 40% of the 37,000 residents in this town have a safe room or a functioning shelter, according to the mayor. This report says there are no bunkers or public shelters which are otherwise ubiquitous across most Israeli towns and cities. All right, that feeds these big myths about Israel that people want to believe. There is a group called Honest Reporting that published facts about all this. Here's what they pointed out. Over half of all Israeli homes, Jewish, Muslim, Christian, lack access to a safe room, according to the Israel Builders Association. Many Israeli cities have huge populations living in older buildings without safe rooms. Israel's civil defense gaps are real, but they are the product of decades-old infrastructure challenges, uneven urban development, and the strain of being a country under constant threat. You wouldn't know any of that from the CNN report, of course, because even the slaughter of Israeli Arabs by Iran has to somehow be blamed on Israel. This report, by the way, also referred to this town as Palestinian and the people in it as Palestinians, even though in repeated surveys, the vast majority of Israeli Arabs have said they prefer to be called what they are, which is Israeli Arabs, as opposed to a part of a Palestinian movement. I've asked CNN why they're using that term. Shocker, I have not heard back. As for these attacks, I can tell you from having been inside CNN, we never do this for attacks anywhere else. Blame the party that was hit. And you've seen this yourself. When Israel launches attacks on military targets in Gaza and there are civilians being used as human shields, CNN never says, well, Hamas, which controls Gaza, has refused to protect its citizens and separate them from military sites and even allow them access to shelters. This stuff is so blatant. CNN never says that. But here, all of a sudden, that's the take. And people are so used to this that they don't even think about it. All right, back to Gregg.
So going forward, it would be very nice if CNN would accurately describe and differentiate between military targets and civilian targets. And I think about 90% of the targets that Iranian ballistic missiles have hit after they've gotten through Israel's interceptor system have been of a civilian nature. When you have an organization like CNN report an attack on Tehran, they say that Israel was targeting residential areas, but they don't give the full story. That general was targeted by Israel on the 7th floor on the east side of the building, and evidence shows that Israeli strikes were hitting specific rooms in that building without even damaging any surrounding structures. But then CNN goes about and ignores Israel's urgent evacuation warnings and just says that Israel is bombing residential areas, even going so far as to say that Israeli missiles were leveling entire neighborhoods, even though that's not what happened. And you have to base that on the video evidence coming out of Tehran. But then when the Iranians go ahead and do it, engage in acts of missile terrorism, they are able to devastate an entire city block. But that doesn't get any mention in the press.
He says the New York Times keeps doing this too.
Nowhere is there any mention of the Ukrainian family that was in Bat Yam, who was killed by an Iranian missile. No mention of the babies who have been left homeless. Not only should they try to make sure that civilian casualties are given front page billing, but please don't erase the Israeli victims of this war who are largely being targeted by the Iranians because they're in civilian areas, not because they're anywhere close to military targets.
Gregg says he has been quoted by some big media, including Bloomberg and Newsweek, Fox, which, as you know, I don't talk about much because they don't present themselves as being mainstream, but he's been published there too. But there are a bunch of news agencies that he cannot get through to.
There's still sort of a media firewall which exists within some other media outlets, whether it be CNN, ABC, some of the mainstream network news, that are more interested in reporting around commentary on the story rather than the underlying elements of why one side is incorrect. And I think that gradually, as media diversifies to new stream media towards podcasts like yourself, that the audience will follow where the facts are rather than just going to traditional outlets which were reporting what they think is what's going on rather than what's actually going on.
Coming up, I'm going to tell you something else that his group predicted, which is also maybe shocking in retrospect. When I reported on my recent trip to Israel last week, a bunch of people told me they were surprised to learn that the majority of us on the delegation that I was a part of were not Jewish. There is a lot of interest among open-minded people who have only heard lies about Israel and the people of Israel, Am Yisrael, also known as Jews. And there are these folks who want to learn more. Here's one way you can do that. There is a newsletter called This Week Unpacked. It's for Jewish and non-Jewish people who want to learn about Jewish culture and Israel. They have all sorts of great topics in there. Recent pieces include one on the father of the graphic novel. There's one on over-the-top curses in the Yiddish language. And there's a write-up about a movie that focuses on an Iranian judo athlete. Plus, insights on the ongoing war and more, thanks to a sponsored partnership. If you signed up for this free weekly newsletter using my unique link today, then a little bit of money comes to this show. It takes less than a minute. Just click the link in the show notes or at my newsletter, and you'll just type in your email. This show is listener supported. So this is a way you can help for free, and it means so much. But it only works for a limited time, so sign up today. In 2023, the Middle East Forum put out a paper calling for the immediate disarmament of Gaza because Hamas was planning to invade southern Israel. That invasion happened 5 months later. So, this group sure seems to know a lot. Media, of course you should be listening to folks there. A couple other quick notes before I go. Last week, I put together an episode very quickly, as soon as I got back, explaining how we had managed to escape, the journey we went on, the access we had to a crossing point that would usually be off limits. Anyway, as part of that episode, I mentioned Israel's Iron Dome system. That's a term people are familiar with, but technically, when it comes to the kinds of powerful missiles from Iran, it's not the Iron Dome that works to intercept those. There are these other technologies as well. One is called David's Shield, and there are these ones called Arrows, like Arrows 2 and 3. Can you imagine if Iran and its proxies took all that time and energy that they're putting into trying to find ways to kill people, Jewish and non-Jewish, but especially people like me, Jewish people, and instead put it into health and science and education and climate technologies. Actually, Israel is a leader in climate technology. The World Economic Forum ran a column about how Israel's climate tech sector can help the world meet sustainable development goals. All right, one more note. I was going to tackle another issue this week. It involves hospitals in America and life-saving treatments for women. I did a great interview about this for you with a doctor who has been working to get the media to stop the misinformation. The Iran news supplanted it for this week, but I am planning to have it for you next week. So remember to subscribe so that you see all the episodes when they pop up. Also, rate and review the show. We need more people to go rate and review on the big platforms, Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And also get every cool, open-minded human being on Earth to tune in and do the same. If you can support the show, there are two great ways to do that. One is by becoming a paid subscriber to the newsletter. The other is through a PayPal link you'll find in the show notes. It's just paypal.me/JoshLebs. And send your questions. Paid subscribers do that through the newsletter, and anyone can use a form at my website. I'm happy to hear from you. As always, thank you so much for listening. I will see you next week.